So our first panel is on the Russo-Ukrainian war and global politics. Our speakers are General Philip Breedlove and Volodymyr Dubovyk. Volodymyr is, because of visa issues, unable to be here today, but he is joining us via Zoom. And these are two wonderful panelists to really take on these issues. So let me say a few words about General Breedlove and Volodymyr, and then we will get started. So General Philip Breedlove is a retired general of the U.S. Air Force. He reached there the highest levels of military leadership as one of 6 geographic combatant commanders and Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He had a very distinguished career, and he was served in this role for NATO at a very crucial time, as Dean mentioned, during Russia's initial invasion in 2014. He also led very comprehensive and strategic structural and policy changes in the alliance in this role. He also has experience leading the forces of 28 different nations. So I really can't think of a better person to talk about the profoundly international dimensions of this conflict. General Breedlove earned his BA from the Georgian Institute of Technology, which probably explains why he's ended up back there now as a distinguished professor. He received his MA from Arizona State University, also a master's in international security from National War College. He is a CEO of Emerald Coast Strategic Solutions and currently serves on the Georgia Tech Civil and Environmental Engineering School Advisory Board. At Georgia Tech, he's a distinguished professor in the Samdon School of International Affairs and also the senior advisor to the Fairfax National Security Solutions and on the board of the directors of the Atlantic Council. So many different roles that he brings to the table. Volodymyr Dubovyk, who's our second speaker, is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and the director of the Center for International Studies at the Menshikov National University, which is located in Odessa, Ukraine. Professor Dubovyk has conducted research at the Kennan Institute and at the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland. He's taught at the University of Washington and at St. Edward's University and the University of Texas in Austin. He's also visited us here in the past to KU, and we'll hope to bring him back in person in the future. He's been a Fulbright Scholar not once, but twice, and is the co-author of Ukraine and European Security. He has published numerous articles on U.S.-Ukraine relations, regional and international security, and Ukraine's foreign policy. Currently, in addition to his work in Odessa, he's a visiting professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And so we'll now kick off our first panel. I'll ask each presenter to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a group discussion and open it up for questions. The questions posed to the panel to begin with are very broad on purpose, and I want to encourage you to interpret this however you'd like, but these are, I think, very important questions. First, how has the war changed global politics? And second, how will the war's future course be shaped by the international political context? And so without further ado, I'll turn things over to General Breedlove.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I bring greetings from Senator Nunn, who still actively participates in our school and the whole School of Samdon International Affairs. I had my speech literally sort of frozen in my mind for this morning, and then I watched the news this morning. And the introduction to what I want to say changed completely because a very important politician this morning made my points from last night better than I did. And so I want to capitalize on that a little bit to start my very few remarks this morning. I'm not going to quote the Prime Minister of Japan, but you all know that he's in a visit to America and he spoke yesterday. And part of what the Prime Minister said yesterday is he was discussing the importance of what's going on in Ukraine. And he's here as part of his visit to try to urge America as sort of the leader of the Western coalition that is supporting Ukraine to step back up to the table, because as you know, we have backed away from the table of support to Ukraine in the past several months. And I'm not going to quote the prime minister because I would get it wrong. So I will paraphrase what I heard on the news, and that is that the prime minister basically said to our leaders, if we don't get it right in Ukraine, or if Ukraine falls, Asia could be next. And if we tear that apart, it's a wonderful segue or introduction to how I wanted to answer the two questions that were posed to me. If we look at what our policies around the world say in vocal and in written form, the world sort of has a view of our policies towards Ukraine, towards Iran, towards China, towards North Korea. And if you Google, you can listen and see lots of things that we say. But as I said last night, your mother probably said to you in your life that people don't care what you say, they watch what you do. And so when asked what our policies are in certain areas, especially on Taiwan, as I served for our U.S. military for a while as the Joint Staff's expert on China, Taiwan, and Korea, as people ask me, what are our policies on these things, I tell them it really, in my mind, doesn't matter what our policies are, because our policies are being demonstrated every day in Ukraine. Our policy towards Iran, towards China, towards North Korea, people are watching what we're doing with and for Ukraine, and from that, they derive what America's true policies are. In other words, just like your mother said, people don't care what you say, they watch what you do. And so that is the introduction to what I think are a series of issues that we have built for ourselves. As I said last night, I still work for our government in several capacities. I teach at Georgia Tech. I have my own consulting firm. What I'm about to say doesn't represent any of those. It's my opinion, and you all asked me for my opinion, so I will give it to you. I'd like to repeat for some of you a thing I said last night. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, and they occupied and still hold today 20% of the nation of Georgia. I've grossly oversimplified that. There are issues on both sides of the ledger, but the fact of the matter is Russia amassed its army, marched across the borders through the tunnel, basically, and they occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, and they remain there today. My opinion is that the world and the West's response was inadequate to task. And in the end, we rewarded bad behavior by allowing Russia to hold 20% of another nation. In late winter of 13 and early winter and spring of 14, Russia amassed its military force, invaded and occupied, and still do today, the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine, and then invaded and occupied a large portion of what we call the Donbas in eastern Ukraine. I would offer once again, my opinion is the Western response was inadequate to task, and we rewarded bad behavior for a second time by allowing Russia to hold on to 12 or 13% of the most important commercial part of Ukraine, destroying the city of Mariupol, which was the largest agricultural port for Ukraine, and then holding the Ukrainian Peninsula of Crimea, which contained the second most important port in Ukraine, and if used correctly, could dominate the northern Black Sea. So now we find ourselves in 2024. In the 10th year of this war, and the conversations internationally seem to be aimed at how will we solve this war? And the most often talked about solutions are to capitulate to Russia a third time, give them more of Ukraine to accomplish peace, and then move forward. That would be the third time that we would have rewarded bad behavior in Russia. And as I said last night, and some laughed, and that was the intention, was to get a laugh. In raising 3 children and now helping to raise 3 grandchildren, here's an axiom that I learned. If you reward bad behavior and you reward bad behavior and you reward bad behavior, you're not going to get good behavior next. You're going to get more bad behavior. And so the thrust of what I would like to say this morning is, how has this war changed international politics or global politics? I would offer that we in the West have developed a propensity to allow bad behavior at all costs to avoid any sort of conflict or the possibility of conflict. Now, we have to be academically honest here. None of us wants to go to war. My daughter wears the uniform of our country. She's already deployed once, and her husband wears the uniform of our country, and he's already deployed once. I don't want my children to face the wars I had to face in my 39 years in the military. So I'm not reckless in these thoughts, but we do not have any zero risk ways forward. If we do nothing, the risk builds every day. Mr. Putin has been rewarded twice, maybe rewarded 3 times. And if you read the papers he gave us at the war, at the beginning of this latest phase of the war, his intention is to keep doing this. He has a plan to reestablish and change completely the security architecture of Eastern Europe. And he will continue on his path. So there is no risk. I mean, there is no risk ways ahead. And if we do nothing, the risk builds every day that eventually he bumps into a NATO nation or something else that triggers a larger conflagration. I think at this point, we have broken the laws that were taught in the war colleges and in the international schools. And we often refer to the old dead guys, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Jomini, and they postulate about war. And Clausewitz was very famous about how war is a continuation of politics. And so we are told by these old dead guys that we should deter our enemy and not allow our enemy to deter us. And we are told to seek, seize, and hold the initiative and not become responsive to our enemies. I would say in American baseball terms, we are 0 for 2 in this category. We are deterred. Russia's continual discussion of nuclear politics and widening the war has deterred us. I believe that our leaders are seeking a no risk way ahead, and there is no risk way ahead. And so I believe that the current war is a continuation of a series of decisions made by both sides of the aisle across the last 15 to 20 years, which has placed us in a mode where we are not addressing the risks that are building. We are deterred. In Ukraine, we said at the beginning of the war, if you do this, we're going to do this. And if you do that, we're going to do this. And if you do that, we're going to do this. that is ceding, giving the initiative to the enemy. We have been reactive in this conflict for 10 years, certainly for the last 2 years. So I believe that our politics have adopted a state that I don't believe is sustainable over the long time, because we see these autocrats, these kleptocrats around the world who recognize what the West is willing to do and what the West is not willing to do. And they are systematically taking advantage of what they see in our performance. I'd like to close with a short argument, and I look forward to questions afterwards. I'm often asked, how is this war going to end? Last night, I discussed what I think are the 3 ways forward. If you want, we can talk about in the questions and answers. But this, I repeat all the time. This war is going to end exactly how Western policymakers determine it will end. If we enable Ukraine to win the war, Ukraine will win the war. If we do what we're doing now, which is at purpose, not giving Ukraine what they need to win the war, Ukraine will lose the war. This war, the conclusion of it and how it ends will completely be determined by Western policymakers. And I think that we need to make different decisions than we've been making over the past 2 decades. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, General Breedlove, for those introductory remarks. And now we'll turn things over to Professor Dubovyk.
Thank you, Erik. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. Unfortunately, as Erik has mentioned, I wasn't able to come physically in person to Lawrence to take part in
Yes,
this.
can you hear us, Volodymyr?
I can hear you.
We can't quite hear you. If you could just hold on 1 minute.
My sound is unmuted. I'm not sure. Hello? Hello? Am I frozen or what?
Okay, can you try again?
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
It looks like the volume on that is down off. All right, Volodymyr, can you try again, please?
Yes, hello? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
go ahead.
Okay, so you can hear me now, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good, great, thanks. All right, so thank you for having me. It's such an important and seminal conference. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to take part. As was mentioned by Erik, unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there in person. I hope that there will be more chances for me to visit Lawrence University in Kansas more times in the future. Like I did in the past, I actually did work with cooperate with 4 different directors of the center. My good friends, Paul Danieri and Eric Heron, and then my great friend, actually childhood friend, Vitaly Chernesky, and now with Erik Scott. So it's a great pleasure for me to be now not in flesh and blood, but online at this conference at the University of Kansas. And let me conclude by saying Rock Chalk Jayhawk. What a pleasure to be on a panel with General Breedlove. I actually saw General Breedlove quite recently, about a year ago, in February of 2023, when I had an honor to deliver a keynote speech at the 3rd annual Semnan School Symposium at the Georgia Tech. It's good to see that General still is very sharp and clear understanding of what's going on and what is important and what is not. So I agree absolutely, 100% with everything that he said. But of course, my view and my position would be as one of Ukrainian scholars. Let me say that I think that one of the things that the general has concluded, one of the points that he has concluded his presentation, I would like to underscore that as well. I think that lack of strategic ambiguity is a big mistake on the part of the West, specifically of this US administration. I think that you need to be more creative with dealing with Russia and supporting Ukraine. And I think that what is indeed needed is not the constant fear of escalation, but on the contrary, sometimes what is needed is more of a bold and creative approach and a need to recapture initiative, because there's been so much reaction instead of proactive approach. Everyone is reacting to what Russia does. You know, everyone is like thinking like, oh, okay, what's Putin does next? Let's wait and see what he does, and then we'll see what we do. It's been a wrong cycle of decision making all along, and you know, the headlines in the newspapers that are full of these headlines, these titles like, oh, the fearing or waiting new escalation by Russia. No, I mean, I guess you need to put Russia in a situation when they would have to react, to and scramble and think like, what's next, and can we actually do it, and aren't we weak enough to deal with it? So I guess there is a need for more over this boldness in dealing with Russia, what Russia is doing. Too much of what West is doing is predictable. It's not entirely up to West how this war will end. Of course, it's also up to Ukrainians, and Ukrainians have demonstrated again and again in the last 2+ years the resilience that we have in us. It's a major test of that resilience. I must say that paradoxically enough, maybe the first weeks and the months of the big war, of large-scale war, were even easier in a way than what we're having now. Because now we're actually having a test with the war, which is getting protracted, dragging on and on and on. You know, it's having more and more impact on Ukrainian economy. It's actually killed already a lot of the best Ukrainian fighters. It keeps millions of Ukrainians away from their homes, some as temporary, you know, as an eternal displaced persons, and some as refugees. So it's actually placing a huge toll on Ukraine, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian society. So the ultimate test of resilience actually comes now, when Ukraine is not winning as such, it's not losing, it's not winning. You know, the only major accomplishment for Russian forces in the last year and a half was the capture of Avdiivka, for which they paid dearly. So they're not necessarily winning on the front of the naval front. It's even more so. Ukraine is delivering another blow after another blow against the Russian Navy. That's been a success story, which is often neglected actually by Western media and Western public, that Russia is basically hiding away, that Russian naval assets in the Black Sea have become sitting ducks, and they had nothing they could have offered to undermine Ukrainian grain corridor, which is now functioning. And basically the same amount of grain is now coming from Ukraine to the rest of the world as it did before February 2022. So that's a great success for Ukraine. I mean, of course, Russia can be disruptive, and it is. In my hometown of Odessa, the last few days were really hard. You have a combination of missile strikes and drone attacks, and missiles, mostly ballistic missiles. So that's a case when it flies so fast. You know, first you hear the boom and explosion in the city or in the field or the energy infrastructure facility, and then only the sirens, the air raid alerts are on, because the strike is so fast. The similar situation is happening, obviously, on the other side of Ukraine with another big city in the east and the south of Ukraine, which is Kharkiv. Kharkiv is basically being demolished as we speak. And now a lot of people are afraid that Putin might actually have idea to turn it into second Mariupol, which is even bigger, because Mariupol is big enough, about 500,000 people population. Kharkiv is bigger than 1 million. Well, maybe right now it's about 1 million, but before the war, even bigger, larger than 1 million. And there's been a lot of destruction directed at Kharkiv. Why are they doing this? I mean, first of all, they're still trying to break the will of Ukrainians. And I think that we need to understand that. But also there's a message to the West, of course. Ultimately, what Putin is doing, he's saying, look, Ukrainians are suffering. There is no way for them to win this. We're going to win this. We're confident. They're bracing. You know, so you better stop supplying Ukraine with what you're giving to Ukraine. It's inadequate. It's not enough. You know, be serious, be reasonable, be sensible. push Ukraine, push Zelensky towards signing some kind of a peace treaty where Ukraine would recognize, the giveaway of surrender of certain territories to Russia. So the currently occupied territories would be kept by Russia, which would be a disaster for Ukraine in so many respects, and for the West as well. I mean, they're going to invite even more bullies like Putin to do that, which General Breedlove mentioned already, around the globe to do what Putin is being doing. If he gets away with it, if he gets rewarded with some sort of victory, that would be a tremendous setback, not just for Ukraine, but for a lot of other places around the globe. So that's a problem, So when the first question is like, is this a wake-up moment for the global political order in this war? We don't know the answer yet. We're in the middle of it. It's still ongoing. How it will end, that would determine the answer to that first question of this panel. Has the war changed global politics? Are we seeing some temporary rearrangements? Are we seeing some tactical opportunistic moments? Or are we actually seeing the wake-up moment for the broader security space, European, Euro-Atlantic security space? I'm hoping for the latter, but I don't know the exact answer to this question. There have been some rearrangements, there have been some things that have been done to help Ukraine, some very successful initiatives. Early on, of course, the sanctions been announced and introduced against Russia. They're not working to the extent that they would alter Russian behavior, unfortunately. Russia found a way to, economically, to switch to the war rails and so on. And so they're producing even more weapons now than they used to before the war, the big war, which is unfortunate. And so there are many loopholes in the sanctions regime. There is a lot of potential to go in that direction to improve the sanctions pressure on Russia. There are many things that still need to be done, I think, in terms of using the frozen Russian assets in the West to help Ukraine. Presently, even, I think there is a lot of rationale for not just waiting until the war is over and then using some of that money to reconstruct Ukraine and rebuild Ukraine, but I think there is a lot of rationale to be using some of that money to help Ukraine as we speak, to buy weapons and so on. The EU has shown that it's actually a very robust security actor, something we didn't expect, because we learned over years and years that the EU is mostly a talk shop, a place where they talk and there's a lot of talk and no walk. But in this particular case, the EU actually has helped Ukraine enormously, hosting refugees, giving money to buy weapons. Think about it. Everything, it goes again contrary against everything we knew about EU before as a very cautious, soft security, soft power player. But now EU gives money to Ukraine to buy weapons, and does many other things. And I think it's also a lot of it is up to the personality factor. It's a very robust leadership by Ursula von der Leyen. I think she's actually comes across as the most formidable Western politician in these 2 last years of the war, which is not displayed only in rhetoric, but actually in the decisions that she made. And I must say, I feel a lot of regret that she's not chosen to lead the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forward. But let's see. Hopefully, the one that's chosen at the upcoming Washington summit and further on would be an adequate person there. There are many decisions that still need to be made. Like with the United States, it's a huge opportunity for the United States to change the world for better, to change the world for better, to punish Russia for its aggressive behavior, to send a signal to other bullies and dictators and aggressors around the globe not to follow the example of Vladimir Putin. But you can only send such a signal if Putin is defeated. I think there was a very good and sensible statements coming from this administration in the spring of 22, specifically from Secretary Austin, when he said that the aim for US is to weaken Russia. And he proceeded, weaken Russia to the extent that it ceases to be a threat to the Ukraine and other countries in the region. That very sensible slogan. The aim is not a strategy, okay? It's just 1 or 2 sentences, but it's been a very sensible. But unfortunately, ever since, there have been a lot of step backs and setbacks and too much, I think, concentration on potential escalation on the Russian part, even though in cases when the evidence shown that Russia is probably not capable, not willing to escalate, meaning going to use weapons of mass destruction against Ukraine. I also don't think that Russia is ready to strike a NATO target and NATO country. So what particular escalation are you afraid of? The experience of the last 2 years has been quite clear-cut in the sense that only when you send a signal of weakness or timidity or indecisiveness to Russia, that's when Russia escalates. When you actually show some kind of demonstration of force and persistence and actually a sense of urgency, and you send to Ukraine those new weapons, that's exactly when Putin is caught off guard and he is understanding that his war is not proceeding the way he has planned. So I guess these lessons for the future should be kept in mind. Another issue, of course, is NATO. NATO has made some good lessons, I think, out of what we are seeing in Ukraine in the last 2 years. But Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Quite frankly, I think that Ukraine should be made a member of NATO. The sooner the better. There's no need to announce that this war would have to end before Ukraine is invited. I think it's an invitation for Putin to continue this war indefinitely. Why would he stop the war if he knows that the worst outcome would happen? The war is over, and then Ukraine maybe is invited to NATO. So he would probably choose to wage this war indefinitely. He can do that. He has enough of the staying power and money and resilience and ideologically Russia is ready for a long war, a protracted war. So maybe it's a wrong thing to announce that you're going to do that. Try to have more of that ambiguity, I think, including the issue of membership in NATO for Ukraine. There have been some attempts to think outside of the box in terms of about the membership of Ukraine. There were suggestions, for instance, that the part of Ukraine, about 80+%, that Ukrainian government control should be invited into NATO. I don't think it's a good idea because, first of all, it kind of signals to Putin that, okay, you get away with this 18 or whatever % of Ukrainian territory, we invite the rest of it into NATO. So it's a harmful idea, I think, to the cause of Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. But also, I don't think it's feasible, just logistically, militarily. How are you going to do that? You're going to defend the 80% of Ukraine and the war is going to be raging for the remaining 20%. I don't think that happening. So I suppose that Ukraine should be invited into NATO now, or at least be offered with a very robust and ambitious and bold work plan or road plan at the upcoming Washington summit. NATO's role is huge. I mean, the particular countries of NATO members are helping Ukraine in whichever way they can. And Ukraine is in the process of signing certain security assistance agreements with various countries, most of them being, of course, member states of NATO. The NATO as such, as an organization, as an alliance, is very much absent. It's only now that we're hearing that NATO might actually play a bigger role, and they should. The idea by the current Secretary General of maybe putting together the amount of $100 billion to support Ukraine in the coming years, that's a good, ambitious idea. The idea for NATO to play a bigger role in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, in the case if US continues to stay AWOL from this war, not to mention the certain particular eventuality with the election result this November. If Ukraine is left without American assistance, then Europeans would actually have to play a bigger role, both EU and NATO in particular countries. So I guess there is a lot of that happening around the globe that determines the outcome of this war. For sure, Ukrainian resilience, Ukrainian heroism of Ukrainian nation, not just military, but the entire nation, that's a big part of it. But the collective efforts on the part of other major players around the world are still meaningful. Whatever reason you have to support Ukraine, they're all good. If you're standing with Ukraine because Ukraine is democracy, fighting a authoritarian belligerent regime, that's a reason good enough to continue to stand with Ukraine. And we are seeing countries far away from Ukraine, as Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. One of the reasons for them to help Ukraine is because Ukraine is under attack, is underdog, is a democratic country which is standing up to the assault by a authoritarian regime. If you're only seeing the international regime being broken, international order being broken, and war crimes being committed, if that's what ticks with you, that's a good reason to stand with Ukraine. If you are upset about thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children being kidnapped by Russia in occupied lands, if that's your motivation, that's good enough too. But ultimately, people need to remember that they have their own skin in this war. American national interests are in play. It's not some distant war that has no connection to the future of the United States. On the contrary. So unfortunately, I think President Biden and his team has dropped the ball somewhat on this issue. They didn't talk enough to Americans, explaining to them how support for Ukraine is actually beneficial to American national interests. They only recently started to, course correct a little bit in that respect and talking more about how this is good, how most of the money is actually staying in US, how much of it is actually very good stimulus for Ukraine, for American economy, including actually a lot of military industrial facilities in the red states and the south of the United States. So you need to talk about it to the people, and why, of course, since Biden didn't talk about it and his people, that was a mistake, I think, and that created a vacuum, which was actually filled by a lot of anti-Ukrainian narrative and discourse in American society, which is unfortunate. We're seeing that most Americans still support the idea of helping Ukraine further down the road, but the numbers are not as robust and as high as they were 2 years ago. I think that this is Americans' moment, that they can actually use it to squander. I think that the last 2 years have shown answers to two very important critical questions that were in our mind for decades, like whether American leadership is needed and whether American leadership, global leadership, is possible. And the answer in both of those cases is resounding yes. So first of all, it's needed, and second of all, it's definitely possible. Americans put together this pro-Ukraine coalition of countries, Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and many other things together, and they're leading, but leading and then not leading, and then actually lost in their own domestic political quagmire and dysfunction of American Congress quite often, unfortunately. So I hope that American Congress, by the way, will do sooner the better, of course, so for the sake of Ukraine, but also for the entire international order, will do the right thing after trying everything else. And I hope that there will be lessons learned by a lot of people across the globe, like here in Europe, where I am right now in Germany, for instance. There is a big debate here about the role of Germany. There is no one opinion, but actually a lot of people up in arms, attacking, criticizing the chancellor for being too timid and too suspicious and too cautious and so on. And many other parts in Europe, even in the countries that they were traditionally very soft to Russia, they were kind of softies on Russia, but you've seen changes. You've seen changes in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece. The prime minister of Italy, turned out into one of the most strongest advocates of supporting Ukraine, even though when she was coming to power, a lot of us were terrified that maybe she would be more reflective of a more traditional right-wing approach to this war, which is like, okay, maybe Putin is kind of a friend for us, defender of family values, traditional values, and so on, and Ukraine is not something that we need to support. On the contrary, you have a different situation in Italy. In Greece, it's complete turnaround. Greece is actually one of the major hubs for the military supply effort for Ukraine right now. And quite recently, the Prime Minister of Greece was in Odessa, my hometown. And what happened? Some of you might be aware of that. There was a missile flying and hitting several hundred yards away from where President Zelensky and Prime Minister of Greece were standing. So that brought message home. It's not far away. When Russian drones fly into Romania across Danube, when Russian missiles travel on Polish airspace, that's a constant reminder of this war being not some other planet, not a planet away, but very close to where you are. And there is a need, like I said, and I'll conclude with this, not just for the sake of Ukraine or my home country, which of course I worry about, but for the entire European, Euro-Atlantic security, to stay the course, to help Ukraine. Nothing is lost in this war yet. War is still not going well for Russia, not remotely to their plan that they had before they attacked us in February 2022. So if you show resilience, if you show sense of urgency, if you continue to support Ukraine, I think we can all win in this war. And again, by defeating Russia, I mean, what people are saying, what do you mean by defeating Russia? I'm not talking about occupying Russia. I'm not talking about Ukrainian American soldiers having a victory parade in the Red Square in Moscow. No, just restoring Ukrainian territorial integrity and teaching Putin and others a lesson. I think that's a very good, very noble, and quite feasible task at hand. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So we've heard some very interesting and stimulating and I think really resonant comments from both of our presenters about the need for U.S. and its allies to be more creative, less reactive, more bold, and sort of get out of this defensive crouch that we found ourselves in. And I want to sort of push you both on that a little bit to hear you. I'm curious if you could give one or two examples of how we might do that. To General Breedlove, I'm curious what you think about Dr. Dubovyk's suggestion. You know, one bold approach would be to encourage NATO membership for Ukraine while the war is still ongoing, or if you think there are other approaches. And just stepping back a bit from Ukraine and looking at the broader Black Sea region, I agree completely that the signal sent in 2008, although the roots of Russia's war with Georgia are complicated, can go back to the 90s or the 80s. You know, this was an invasion and was treated very lightly. There was some strong rhetoric and very little action. So looking beyond Ukraine, what can the U.S. and its allies, we can't go back to 2008, but how can we respond to Russian encroachments in Georgia and Moldova? So General Breedlove, if you'd like to go first, sort of outlining what you think about this NATO enlargement idea or other approaches we could take toward Ukraine that would be bolder and more creative, less reactive, and then what you think we can do to respond to what's happening in Georgia and Moldova, and then we'll go on to Dr. Dubovyk.
Well, first of all, thank you, and it's great to see you again, sir. I was hoping to meet you here in person. And I really love a couple of things that you talked about. I want to highlight them. I said them not as eloquently as he did. We need some ambiguity for Mr. Putin to worry about. Remember, at the beginning of this last part of this 10-year war, we gave an entire list to Mr. Putin. You don't have to worry about this, we're not going to do it. You don't have to worry about this, we're not going to do it. You don't have to worry about that, we're not going to do it. This is not how a military person would start off a war, telling the enemy what he doesn't have to worry about. We need Mr. Putin worried about what we're doing. And we do need to regain the initiative. Mr. Putin needs to be on his back foot. We have spent 10 years on our back foot, and we need him to be concerned about that. So I actually believe that NATO membership is important for Ukraine. But I must be a realist. Having sat in meetings for 3 years at the highest level and listening to what NATO calls the open door policy, there is an interpretation of the North Atlantic Treaty and what it says, and that interpretation I don't believe is correct, but it has been the interpretation for many, many years, decades upon decades, and that is that if a nation has a territorial dispute, that we're not going to invite it in, because it would mean we might immediately have to go to war. Now, again, I don't personally agree with that interpretation, but I don't count anymore. You know, I'm a retiree, I'm growing camouflage now. And so it's important what NATO does. And there are still those members who are going to be incredibly, is not a strong enough word, reticent to bring aboard a nation that has a land dispute or an occupation by an enemy into the alliance. We jokingly used to call it Mr. Putin's veto. When the nation wants to become a part of NATO, invade a little bit of it and hold it. That's our veto. Now they're not going to be considered. But it's just about that straightforward. And so while I agree that we should be after NATO membership, I think that it's going to be a tough road to hoe, as my father used to say, to get to that point. So how to respond? May I tell you that one of the toughest conversations I've had with dear friends for many years is how the United States handled the Budapest Memorandum of '94. How many of you are familiar with the Budapest Memorandum of '94? In 1994, many people in the world were really worried about Ukraine sitting on the second largest cache of nuclear weapons out there. And there were some concerns about which way Ukraine's military might turn in a war, primarily by Russia. But there was a huge concern about what was going to happen with this nation that had all of this capability. Now, whether they really had the capability or not, that's a whole other conversation. But the fact is they had a lot of nuclear weapons and they had a military now that nobody understood sort of which way it was going to point. And so we were a part of a group of 4 nations, US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine, that signed a memorandum called the Budapest Memorandum. And in that memorandum, the main focus was getting the nukes out of Ukraine. But also, by those that were at that conference that led to this memorandum, there was concern about the orientation of the Ukraine military. So by and large, we signed an agreement that denuclearized and sort of reoriented the military of Ukraine. And part of that agreement was that we gave assurances, listen to the words because they're very important. We gave assurances that we would protect the sovereignty of the nation of Ukraine and that we would protect their sovereign borders. My great disappointment with my great country, which I love deeply, is that in my mind, this was all done in a very bad way, having talked to people that were at the conference. One, it was not made a treaty, so it did not have the validity and the strength and durability of a treaty. And 2, the language was chosen very carefully. I have been critical and said very slimily, because we didn't guarantee these things, we assured them of these things. And so I may be wrong, but I will tell you, I believe, having talked to some that were there, that we created this document and never really intended to stand behind the document. So those 4 nations signed the document, and we, including the aggressor, agreed to protect the sovereignty and the sovereign borders of Ukraine. Russia has attacked Ukraine now 3 times. You can grade our paper as to whether we have protected or assured the sovereignty of Ukraine and their borders. I would say we are 0 for 2. And so I'm a little disappointed on being a little pointed. Why did I bring this up? Because if we're not going to have NATO membership in the near future, I believe that Western leaders, and that includes the United States, should put forward a coalition of states that give certain guarantees at the level of treaty commitment to Ukraine about their sovereignty. NATO may not sign on to that en masse because of the perception that there is an aggressor, there is a land dispute, and therefore not eligible. But I believe that we would need to do something for Ukraine that actually has binding implications. And Ukraine is going to be very suspicious because they were not treated well by the Budapest Memorandum of '94. And so we would have to be very specific and very dedicated to anything that might come forward. And I would just offer that while I just re-say what I said at the beginning, I support NATO for Ukraine. But because I'm a realist, I think we need to build something in the interim that has authority. And because we have failed them in that regard once, we would have to be much more explicit about our commitment to something we would do in the future.
Thank you. Dr. Dubovyk, would you like to respond to the question?
Yes, I actually agree. I'm also a realist. I don't think that the membership will be offered to Ukraine while this war is raging. But I also see the downside of it in a situation when Russia can continue the war for eternity. So and never give a chance to invite Ukraine into NATO. So that is a problem. But also we are seeing some change in the attitude to the United States in Ukraine now, which is going from better, more positive attitudes to not so positive because of the current, of course, huge delay with authorizing new assistance package by the Congress, but also by what administration has been doing too little too late sometimes. Often some assistance was offered and not delivered for the time later. The Lend-Lease format wasn't used, which in the retrospect, I think was a mistake, because I believe this administration thought that the money will be there, given by Congress to help Ukraine, and not thinking about alternatives. So maybe if more of the assistance would have been sent via Lend-Lease mode, then more of the money, committed, allocated by Congress would have been saved and still be available, who knows, to give to Ukraine right now when we are actually having a very difficult moment in the front line. So I think that there have been some mistakes by this administration. Ukrainians are seeing also debates about what the US would want to see at the end of this war, the lack of commitment to the victory for Ukraine, or trying to avoid even using words like defeating Russia. The one statement which I have mentioned from spring of 22 by Secretary Austin was actually walked back by the White House, even though it was very sensible. And I think quite cautious statement about weakening Russia, because, of course, you're trying to weaken Russia. What else are you trying to do by helping Ukraine? That's a reason, So I think that a lot of people now talk also about the new formats, more realistic, feasible formats for support of security of Ukraine as we speak. Because basically what I see as an expert in security studies is three different chronological levels of what Ukraine needs security-wise, what we need right now in the middle of this major, huge existential war, what we're going to need in 2, 3, 5 years from now, so midterm level, and what we're going to need in the future. Because Russia will continue to be a threat to Ukraine, no doubt about that. We listen what they say, and they mean what they say. Every week, sometimes every day, Putin or others, they come up with more and more statements about how Ukraine is an aberration, historical aberration, non-historical nation, shouldn't exist, a mistake of nature or something. There is no such thing as Ukrainian nation. There is no such thing as Ukrainian culture, or Ukrainian language. They destroy the books, they repress the teachers from high schools who teach Ukrainian culture in occupied lands and so on. They burn the books and so on. So Russia will continue to be the threat, existential threat to Ukraine. And therefore, we need to think about it. Maybe there is a new format going forward in relations with NATO plus partner or something. Because we are right now actually in a very unique situation. No one ever within NATO has received so much assistance as Ukraine did receive in the last 2 years without being a member of NATO. So that's a unique context right there. What Ukraine needs in terms of security guarantees, of course, NATO couldn't give it. Even if Ukraine is invited into NATO, what Ukraine needs is even more than Chapter 5 gives, because a lot of Chapter 5 commitments and guarantees are vague on a purpose. We all know that if a NATO country, God forbid, is attacked, it doesn't mean that all other member states would immediately, like within 1 hour or 1 day, would actually rush their troops to help that which one is under attack. So there will be other modes and ways to and levels and levers to help and assist in defending attack the ally under attack. So what Ukraine needs is even more. So no one can give it to Ukraine. There is a talk about coalition of willing to help Ukraine more, while others may be still not decided, as General has just mentioned. But again, I don't see the guts to actually offer boots on the ground, for instance, or close the sky initiatives for Ukraine. There is no new call for closing the skies over Kharkiv. How you even do that? Kharkiv is just a couple, several kilometers away from Russian border, so you can't do it. So what we are seeing right now, of course, is not security guarantees, unfortunately, for Ukraine. So there is a huge gap between what Ukraine needs and expects and wants on one hand, and what other our allies, the most devoted allies to Ukraine, actually, and partners, supporters of the Ukrainian cause, can offer. But it's the best thing after what still it's the best thing we can get right now. So I'm optimistic about the assistance packages being offered to Ukraine. What makes them important is that there's they need to be strategic in nature. So not just thinking about what you're going to give to Ukraine in the next coming months or even a year. Should be like up to 5 years, better 10 years. Should be more concrete, like what are you offering to give to Ukraine? So I believe that right now that's what we can get: militarization of Ukraine plus those security assistance packages offered by other willing countries. That's the best way forward. But much will depend, of course, on US role. Like I said, it would be very unfortunate, historically. And if you look at it, at this episode many years from now in the future. And if you look at it and you say that US had this unique opportunity to provide leadership for the good cause, for the better world of tomorrow, and squandered it. So I hope that there will be a right decision made by the United States.
Thank you very much. I want to ask one last question before we open this up. This is a panel that was about global politics. So I want to step back. We've been focused on North America and Europe. To ask about the broader globe, and in particular about what is sometimes referred to as the global south. Now, I realize that's somewhat a problematic term because the global south is not one unified space. It's many different countries pursuing different agendas. But analysts have pointed out that the relative lack of support that Ukraine has had from very major countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, has been a weak point in the U.S. Effort to build a global response to enforce a global sanctions regime. So what can the U.S. do, and what can Ukraine do to engage these countries and to build a broader coalition, if not a military coalition, right, to defend Ukraine, but a broader coalition to work with the U.S. to support a common policy for Ukraine. So I'll ask each of you to respond briefly, and we'll open it up for broader questions.
I'll jump in there first and start with a personal story in that I was once in Africa to visit 7 nations, and every nation I landed in, no matter where I landed, no matter where the airport was, in my journey to the embassy and to visit with the local leaders, I was driven past the football stadium that China had built in that country. And so what is the messaging there? And the message that I take from this is that China is competing in these spaces in a far more successful way than we are. If you actually look at the aid that we put into these countries, it's much more purposeful. It's much more truly impactful to some portions of the needy things that are happening in some of these. So I'm not criticizing U.S. aid, but we're losing the battle for the hearts and minds because of the way that China moves in to these countries and the way that they use money and attach strings to their money in these countries. And so the reason I bring this up is I really don't have a big philosophical answer to your question, rather that the competitive space of the global South is being fought for with a lot of different tools. And while we may believe, and I actually do, that our tools may be having more substantive impact in these spaces, what they are not having impact on is the decision makers, the politicians, and to some degree, the public of these countries that are being competed for. And so I believe that we may have to rethink how we do business, not meaning give frivolous aid, but we've got to figure out how to better be impactful with our aid in a way that moves policymakers in the South.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Dubovyk, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think that the war reverberates around the globe in so many ways. I mean, we're all aware of the situation when the Russian Navy was able initially to block Ukrainian ports, including my hometown of Odessa, and how it actually affected the situation in food markets with agricultural products around the globe, and how a lot of people were hungry and everyone was terrified about this whole situation. So it's great that it's now been kind of solved, because Ukraine has been able to produce more of agricultural produce and deliver it to the market. But also in an immediate surrounding neighborhood where Ukraine is, so many things are hinging on the war. Like, for instance, in Belarus, if Russia loses the war, Ukraine wins the war, that's a chance for Belarusian people to actually once in their lifetime to have free and fair election, have democracy restored in their country. In Moldova, I met a lot of times, I met with a lot of Moldovan colleagues and experts and politicians. They actually were sitting on their suitcases when Russian troops were advancing in the first days of the major war, large war, scale war, going towards Odessa, but then they got stuck around Odessa, and that's how Moldova got relaxed, because they knew that their state will continue to exist. There are impact you can see in the South Caucasus clearly, with Armenia now actually repositioning themselves in so many ways, quite unexpectedly to some. There is, in fact, in the Middle East, if you look at the Moscow-Tehran connection there with Iranian-made weapons attacking my home country and killing people in Odessa, including children. Those Shahed drones, they do that. So there is a connection there. There is clearly a connection to China as well. And a lot of people, some people in US, I know, they say we should focus on China, not in Russia, but there is a connection there. And the logic to proceed along which you need to not to think how you can actually drive a web between China and Russia, but you need to think how you weaken Russia, how you defeat Russia as a major ally for China. First of all, to be a signal for China not to do what Putin did to Ukraine. And second of all, China will be left without such a formidable ally as Russia, if Russia is defeated in this war. So there is a major connection. And the global South is another one. We need to talk about how this war that Russia wages is imperialistic war. And we're talking about it. And Minister Kuleba, Minister of Foreign Affairs, has been to Africa several times in the last 2 years. And I know the Secretary Blinken has been often in Africa as well. There is a concerted effort there to change hearts and minds there, to win hearts and minds of the global South. But we're also seeing a lot of inertia of the Cold War times when they had a non-alignment movement. And in many ways, some people are still saying that's not our war. It doesn't really concern us. So why are you pressing us, US or Kiev or Ukraine, trying to change our position and take a side in this war? And Russia has a major presence, of course, there economically and with Wagner troops. And diplomatically, quite frankly, Ukraine often has one small embassy, 10 African countries. And Russia has a huge embassy in each African country where you have ambassador who has a good connection to local political elites. Russian, propaganda presence has been there, built for years, with Russia Today and others, basically trying to present this war as some kind of a proxy imperialistic Western war against Russia, using Ukraine as a tool, and it's very hard to change this narrative, to to fight this narrative back and change hearts and minds overnight. But we are now understanding that there is a problem, and we're now doing more to address it.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Dubovyk. We'll open it up now for questions, and what I'd like to do, given that we have about 10 minutes left, is to try to bundle the questions together. So if it's okay with the speakers, we'll take a few questions and ask people to respond to them in a batch. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have a microphone coming around. Maybe we'll start with you got Lilo over there. And then move on down the road.
Thank you very much, General. Thank you very much for everyone for this great speech. I was very impressed yesterday about your presentation. It's essential. My name is Igor Lilo. I'm professor of history for Ukraine here in the Kansas University. Actually, thank you very much, especially for you mentioned that this war has 10 years, not 2 only. But we Ukrainian historians suppose that this war has more like 300 years. You know, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it's an existential conflict, you know, about Ukrainian national and Ukrainian identity and all.
Yes.
But my question today is the next. Here in the US, I still hear the term Putin's Russia, Putin's war. Do you think this war is caused by Putin and his team alone? And how do you see the future of the Russia in the global context?
Great question. And let's take the second question, I think, and then that row as well.
Thank you. My name is Jeremy Roth-Hushel, independent public interest analyst, Jewish American patriot of conscience, and from radical middle. I've been interested in pushing more into the title of the conference in terms of politics. I was happy that General Breedlove brought up Clausewitz and then amended it today or extended it, pointing out that politics really is the source of war, of any kinetic warfare, thus moving deeper into geopolitics, deep politics. And so I would ask, what is the way that we might be more boldly approach the problems of political warfare? And I would like to maybe do a mean between 300 years and maybe a 20-year political war that Russia and Putin waged against Ukraine that shows how it was very much an American political war that has been going on here in terms of domestic politics and Russian information and narrative warfare, by just pointing out, and maybe Dr. Dubovyk can correct me if I have facts wrong, pointing out that the political warfare in Ukraine actually goes back to 2004 intensely in terms of the attack on the Orange Revolution, right? And the Yanukovych versus Yushchenko, where Yushchenko gets the election stolen from him, the Ukrainian people and institutions, parts of the press stand up against it, expose him, and then he gets poisoned, apparently by maybe a Russian asset inside of Ukrainian intelligence. And then finally, we see then American political operatives on the ground, such as Paul Manafort, his election fixer, Mike Connell, enter into the vicinity right in that time. And then now we see the political ramifications of that in terms of 2016, Trump Russia, and the general destabilization of the American sense-making capacity. How can we be more bold in terms of engaging in this political warfare that we're under?
Great, thank you. And was there one more question in the audience? Yeah, in the back there. And then we'll give our respondents a chance to answer.
Thank you. I guess just briefly, from a more language instruction perspective, because that's what I kind of focus on, what would you like to see from instructors, and specifically language instructors, in terms of helping students understand this or maybe prepare for future careers in dealing with this kind of politics?
Great, thank you. So we have 3 questions on the table. The first about whether this is Putin's war or Russia's war and what the implications are for Russia's future. A second question about political warfare, and a third question about what instructors can do to help prepare students, language instructors or other instructors in area studies prepare students to respond to this. Get it with us.
Okay, I would like to punt, as we say in American football, the idea of is this Putin's war to a real expert. So I'm going to ask my fellow respondent to answer that. But I want to say this: I am an optimist when it comes to the human condition. And we hear all of these things about how Russian people are long suffering and they're going to fight this war as long as they're convinced that Ukraine and America are their enemy. They're going to fight this war. But I do believe that what started when the wall came down and us, what I call trying to hug the bear and bring the bear into the West, I believe that's still a noble effort, minus Putin. I don't think it will ever happen when Putin is running Russia. And so I'm going to let a real expert answer the piece about Putin. I just believe that it may take decades or even a generation or two, but I believe the Russian people are people just like you and me. I believe they want their children to go to school. I believe they want food on their table. There's all those things that I think at some point the Russian people with different leadership could be a functioning part of society in this world. That may disappoint, but I'm an optimist when it comes to the human condition. I'm going to disappoint you a little bit too. I don't do politics. I've been invited to testify, or during COVID it was called brief Congress. I still had to raise my right hand 8 times, and I've been invited 4 by the left and 4 by the right. So I have a voice to politicians in DC, and I don't pick sides because then I lose half of that. It just goes away. So, but I do want to talk about a couple of things. You touched several times what NATO calls hybrid war, what some call gray war, what I call war below the lines of kinetic activity, and it is alive and well. We talked a little last night about how active it was in a couple of our past elections. They're going to be infinitely more active in the next election, and they're already active in the politics of our next election. And I think that your point or your question is incredibly important, is we've got to learn how to fight in that war. When Russia attacks a nation, and I would love sometime to, over a beer, talk you through how I believe Russia has attacked Ukraine over the last several decades. All elements of national power. When we respond to Russia, we use economics, and that's it. And we need to get broader than that. We need to understand that we need to be attacking all elements of national power. I also want to say that, and then my Ukrainian friends, if I get this wrong, help me. We talk about the Maidan, but the multiple times I've been on that hill and marching up from that area where the Maidan was happening, my Ukrainian friends always talk about the revolution of dignity. Okay, and so I think right now, today, someone needs to acknowledge what is right and proper in Ukraine and make that a focus of our policy. We're not going to support people who are trying to oppress their neighbors. And we need to be declaratory and public in the statements of how we will change, because we can't continue what we're doing, how we will change our policies towards support for Ukraine and what we want to be the end for Ukraine. And let me address that personal pronoun in just a minute. What we want for Ukraine is not nearly as important as what the Ukrainian people want for Ukraine. And the polling I see, it's demonstrative what the Ukrainian people, and we need to be supporting that. May I offer for the question about the students? I got off on this tangent a little bit last night, but one of the things I think we need to do at universities is help our students to understand what and how and which information they're being fed. We do a class here, I call this a yak back, because it yaks back to you what you want it thinks you want to hear. And if you're a conservative person, your feed's gonna have a lot of conservative stuff. If you're a liberal person, your feed's gonna have a lot of liberal stuff. The numbers are demonstrative. I'm not gonna throw them out there because people would question me. But intelligent agencies in America tell us that in one of our last elections, as much as 16 to 21% of what was appearing in our young people's yak backs was coming straight out of St. Petersburg. Okay? And so one of the things I believe we owe our students is to help them understand and discern that the yak back is not an impartial research tool, and that the yak pack is incredibly susceptible to those who would try to manipulate our youth through the way that they get their news. And the second part, and I'll shut up, is that our nation is driving itself into two camps. And I would offer that when we study liberal arts, we are not studying this part of liberal arts or that part of liberal arts. Liberal arts should drive our students to look at all of the opinions and things that are out there, to be able then to come to a reasoned approach to the problems we're trying to solve. That will come up with a set of solutions that will not equal that. And we need to be helping our students to understand that if all you do is pick up your yak back, it's going to play back to you who it thinks you are, and it's going to make you happy. And you are not going to get both sides of the equation. And so we need to teach discipline in our research and discipline in our approach to examining problems so that we can open our eyes to all the possibilities.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Dubovyk, we are now at 10:31 and just about out of time, and you are also have been sort of kicked a punt to receive. But I do want to give you the final word here, just about a minute or two, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be brief. It's most definitely Russia's war. How do we know it? Because it actually fits really well in the historical narrative of an attitude that Russians have towards Ukraine as some kind of little brothers, someone who need to be led, someone who probably don't even know what they're doing. Ukrainians survived quite miraculously, I would say, over centuries of this big brother hug, of Russian bear. We can remember the Holodomor, the great artificial famine of 1932, 1933 in Ukraine, which was introduced by, Stalin regime, but basically you can say Soviet regime, but Russian also. And you can remember how Russian attempts to actually outlaw Ukrainian culture completely in the 19th century. You can remember many such things. And of course it's Russia's war, because we don't see a major uprising of Russians against the war. Some people are protesting, and we are grateful to them for that. But too many are actually going to the war, actually on their own volition. And we're seeing that, and we're seeing new waves of mobilization. And we're seeing completely bogus reasons, sometimes like now with this recent terror attack at the Crocus Center, that Russians are using now to mobilize more people to go and fight in Ukraine, even though there's no connection between that terror action and Ukraine. But unfortunately, this ideology of a besieged fortress of the West out there gonna get out to get us and destroy Russia and humiliate Russia and using Ukraine as a tool, too many Russians are buying it. So of course it's Russia's war. And the political warfare has been raging for a long time, even before 2004. The next day after 1991 happened, the Soviet Union disintegrated. The Russian Duma, one of the chambers of Russian parliament, already passed a resolution claiming that Crimea is Russian. At that point of time, President Yeltsin and his liberal foreign minister Kozyrev, they all said, oh, no, they're not speaking in the name of Russia, so it's not official position, but that was immediate reaction. That tells you that there's never been this recognition of independent Ukraine. The major problem that Russia always had is that you have independent sovereign Ukraine next door. That should be corrected. That's a mistake. That's a problem. They're going to do away with it by whatever means they can have at their disposal. So it is a political warfare. It is a military warfare. It's been primarily politics, economy, energy before 2014. It's been hybrid between 2014 and 2022, when you use military plus non-military soft power tools. And now it's military, and now Russians basically abandoning the whole idea of Russian war in Ukraine and the soft power and the tools that they used to have. And now basically saying we need to just incorporate as much land of Ukraine into Russia proper as we can. So it's continuation of this centuries-long stance of Russian political elites and unfortunately public, a large part of public towards Ukraine. On language instruction, very important. Of course, you need to understand the world, this threatening world. You need to pay more attention to liberal arts teaching and languages. And I know the language teaching is actually a very strong feature of the University of Kansas. So I hope that there will be a continuation of that. And I hope there will be more money to study or more funds to study Ukraine too. We're fighting for this decolonization in our field because too much of the attention in studying of post-Soviet world has always been on Russian at the expense of others in the post-Soviet world, including Ukraine. And that's what needs to be done. Ukraine is a great country. It deserves, the research on Ukraine deserves to be funded better.
Great. Thank you very much, and I'll second that recommendation. Please join me in thanking our presenters for a wonderful start.